Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking something absolutely massive. We are looking at the incredible kind of whirlwind life cycle of India's first great empire. This was a state that took a completely fractured mosaic of rival kingdoms and forged them into a centralized powerhouse that stretched all the way from the Hindu Kush to the Bay of Bengal. Let's dive right in. So picture this. You've got a unified, technologically advanced, and completely militarily dominant empire. And then, it just suddenly dies. How does that even happen? It's a question historians have been debating for centuries. And to really grasp the fragility of immense power, we actually need to start our story at the very end.
The fate of the last Mauryan emperor, a guy named Brihadratha, around 185 BCE, perfectly illustrates this collapse. He wasn't conquered by some massive foreign invasion. No, he was assassinated by his own commander-in-chief, Pushyamitra Shunga, literally right in the middle of a military parade while he was reviewing his troops. It's the shocking, dramatic moment that proves military power had completely eclipsed dynastic loyalty. But how do we get to a point where the empire center was so hollowed out?
Section 1. The Power Vacuum. To understand the fall, we have to look at the beginning. Back in the 4th century BCE, the kingdom of Magadha had hit the geographical jackpot. We're talking fertile agricultural land, rich iron ore deposits for weapons, and totally dominating the Ganges River trade routes. But its rulers, the Nanda dynasty, had a fatal flaw. Sure, they had an extraordinarily large army and this massive treasury built on heavy taxation, but they were deeply, deeply resented by their own subjects. That made them incredibly vulnerable. Then, enter the ultimate wild card, Alexander the Great. He invades northwestern India in 327 BCE and just completely shatters the local political order of the Indus region. But as we know, his exhausted troops end up mutinying at the Beas River, so Alexander retreats and, dies shortly after. This sudden withdrawal leaves a massive geopolitical power vacuum in the northwest. The board was completely set for someone ambitious to make a move. Section 2. Rise of the Mauryas. It is honestly wild how fast this happens next. In the span of just about 50 years, across 3 generations, the Indian subcontinent goes from totally fragmented to near total unification. It kicks off with Chandragupta seizing power around 321 BCE. Then his son, Bindusara, pushes the empire way further south into the Deccan Plateau. And finally, Ashoka takes the throne around 268 BCE, bringing the empire to its absolute undisputed zenith. Now, Chandragupta didn't just stumble into power. This was highly calculated. He partnered up with this brilliant, somewhat embittered Brahmin strategist named Chanakya. And actually, their first attempt at an uprising in Magadha completely failed. But instead of giving up, they withdrew to that power vacuum in the northwest we just talked about. They built up frontier alliances, absorbed leftover Macedonian forces, and then came back to subvert and entirely overthrow that super unpopular Nanda king. Having secured the core of Magadha, Chandragupta pushes west and clashes with Seleucus I Nicator, who was one of Alexander's successors, and they end up reaching this staggering peace settlement. Seleucus hands over vast territories, basically modern Afghanistan and Pakistan, and what does he get in return? A gift of 500 war elephants. I mean, talk about a legendary trade deal, right? 500 elephants in exchange for a subcontinental empire. Section 3. Ashoka and the Dala. So, fast forward a bit, the empire is expanding aggressively. And around 261 BCE, Ashoka conquers Kalinga, a really powerful kingdom on the eastern coast. It was a brutally devastating campaign. Ashoka's own records claim 150,000 people were deported, and at least 100,000 were killed in the fighting, with countless others dying from the fallout. And this staggering, horrific death toll triggered a profound crisis of conscience in the emperor. He was so deeply moved by this tragedy that he literally carved his remorse into stone for everyone to see. In what's known as his 13th Major Rock Edict, he stated that the killing, death, and deportation of people brought him deep sorrow and regret. Think about that for a second. This is a nearly unprecedented moment in history, an absolute ancient ruler publicly apologizing for his violence and expressing deep regret to his subjects. And this wasn't just personal guilt. It totally rewired the empire's DNA. Before Kalinga, the Mauryan playbook was entirely about violent conquest, military expansion, and aggressive consolidation. But after Kalinga, Ashoka flips the script completely. He pivots toward moral conquest, public welfare, and nonviolence. He's suddenly planting trees, digging wells, setting up medical care for people and animals. He fundamentally redefines what it even means to be an emperor. This whole ideological pivot gets wrapped up in this concept called Dhamma. Now, it's really vital to understand something here. Ashoka personally devoted himself to Buddhism, sure, but Dhamma wasn't just him forcing Buddhism on the masses. It was a brilliant, highly pragmatic civic ethic. It promoted moral conduct and strict religious tolerance for everyone, Buddhists, Brahmins, Jains, you name it. It was essentially an ideological glue, designed specifically to bind a vast, multi-ethnic empire together without having to rely solely on the sword. Section 4. The Administrative Machine. Of course, you can't run a massive superpower on good intentions alone. The foundation of this sprawling administrative machine is often linked to the Arthashastra. This is an ancient, highly systematic treatise on statecraft and economic policy traditionally attributed to Chanakya, that strategist we mentioned earlier. It's basically the ultimate Mauryan playbook for surveillance, taxation, and centralized control. And that playbook built an absolute beast of a hierarchy. Right at the top, the imperial level in Patalipatra, you have the emperor. Underneath that, the empire was carved up into these massive provinces, like Taxila and Ujjain, which were governed by royal princes. And at the ground level, specialized officials managed the districts and villages, handling all the revenue, justice, and order. Greek ambassadors visiting at the time literally marveled at this sophisticated bureaucracy and their massive standing army. It was a machine of unprecedented scale. Section 5. The empire collapses. Okay, so Ashoka dies around 232 BCE, and man, the wheels fall off fast. The empire gets hit with these murky, violently contested succession crises. And without a strong central personality holding it all together, that massive geographic scale suddenly becomes a huge liability. I mean, you just couldn't communicate fast enough across the subcontinent to stop rebellions. Add to that the heavy economic burden of paying for that vast army, regional powers reasserting their autonomy, and renewed Indo-Greek invasions in the northwest. It was the perfect storm. So why did the final blow happen? Well, for a long time, there was this old theory that suggested the assassination of the last emperor was a religious backlash, Orthodox Brahmins pushing back against Ashoka's Buddhism. However, modern historiography, led by scholars like Ramala Thoper, tells a much more pragmatic, conventional story. The actual historical evidence for religious persecution is pretty thin. Instead, what likely happened is that a strong general simply saw a decaying imperial core, saw his chance, and took it. It was a military coup, plain and simple. Section 6. An enduring legacy. The political borders of the Mauryas eventually vanished, sure, but their visual and ideological symbols survived for millennia. It's actually incredible when you think about it. When the modern Republic of India gained independence in 1947, it quite literally built its visual identity on the artifacts of Ashoka's reign. The lion capital of Sarnath, that became India's national emblem. The Ashoka chakra, representing the wheel of Dhamma, it was placed dead center on the national flag. The empire fell, but its memory helped forge a modern nation. The Mauryan story is really the ultimate case study in the fragility of centralized power. When the central strongman fades away, what keeps the bureaucratic and military machine running? As we've seen, without robust institutions that outlive the individual, even the most dominant empires inevitably fracture under their own weight. Looking at these systemic frailties, you have to wonder, what can the massive global superpowers of our world today learn from this ancient collapse? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I hope it leaves you eager to dig even deeper into the historical forces that are still shaping our world today.